Be'ezra Hashem, today's daf is Masechta Horayos Daf Yud Gimel, number 13. And we're going to start from the Mishnah on Daf Yud Beis Amud Beis. And here we go. It's Daf Yud Beis Amud Beis, about I would say 12 lines from the bottom. So the Mishnah begins. Here, let's make it big, as big as I could. Oh, one more maybe. All right. No, that's too big. Okay, so the Mishnah begins. Kohen Gadol, Poirim, we're talking about a Kohen Gadol. When he is an Ovel, right? So a Kohen Gadol, Poirim Milmata. He rips his clothing from the leg, Milmata, from the bottom. It's undefined what that means. By a Hedyed, but a regular Kohen who could be an Ovel, right? Milmala, he rips his clothing from the top. That's the first thing the Mishnah teaches us. We're going to discuss that in the Gemara. Kohen Gadol, a Kohen Gadol, Makriv Oinen. When he's an Oinen, which means that if he lost his a relative, let's say he lost his father or mother or whatever, so he could do the service even though he's an Oinen. A regular Kohen cannot do that. However, Veloy Oichel, he's not allowed to eat the kachim because he's an Oinen, as we saw in Parshas Shemini, where Moshe Rabbeinu demanded they do the service, but maybe they're not to eat. They weren't supposed to eat the Siri Rosh Chodesh. Okay, so they're not allowed to eat. The Hedyet, but a common Kohen, Loy Makrif, when he's an Oinen, he's not allowed to do the service, Veloy Oichel, and he's not allowed to eat kachim. So we discussed in the Mishnah regarding a Kohen, a Gadol, and a Kohen Hedyet. Hi, we just began. So we're discussing regarding we were discussing the Gemara begins. Okay, we're on Yud Beis Amud Beis. The Gemara begins when a Kohen Gadol is, let's say, an Avel, so he rips his clothing, lamata mamish, because the Chumash says that a Kohen Gadol is not allowed to rip his clothing when he's an Avel. B'godav lo yifraim. So, but let's say he wants to feel that he's part of it. So then we allow him to rip his clothing from the bottom of his clothing, like from his pants, let's say, uh, by his legs. And Lamala, when we say a Kohen Hedyot could rip his clothing, of course, a Kohen Hedyot is like a regular oval. Lamala Mamish, he rips his clothing Mamish from the top. As you're familiar, you rip like a regular oval. Shmuel says that differences are not so extreme. Lamata, when we say a Kohen Gadol could rip, is lamata mikame sofer. It's the bottom. It's the bottom from the edge. I have a picture over here. You see this picture of this guy. He made a rip, but he didn't make the rip from the edge of the shirt. A little bit below. A Kohen Gadol could do that. However, a Kohen Hedyot, he has to rip in order to be Yotzes ripping. He has to rip from the top of the shirt. So that's what we're saying over here. That's what Shmuel says. So zev zev, but both bitzavar should be by the neck. Zev zev, bitzavar should be by the neck. Says the Gemara, Meisve, I'm going to ask a question against Shmuel. The Mishnah, the Brisa says, I'll call a Mason Kula, and every time somebody dies, a relative dies, Ratza me'avdel kame safa shaloi, Ratza einim avdel kame safa shaloi. If you want to rip below the edge of the shirt, you could rip, like I showed you in the picture, or if you want to rip at the edge of the shirt, that's fine. And rotza einim of the kamisafish loy, or you don't have to rip at the edge of the shirt. You can rip below that. That's considered a rip. But for the respect of your father, mother, mavdo, you should do it from the edge of the shirt, not from below that. So now the Gemara continues its question. So we see that to be yotze, the ripping as an aval, this is called a rip. That's called a rip, what the Kohen Gadol is going. So, Kivin de Ma'al Mahavakara, since you call it a rip, so then if the Kohen Gadol does that, Kari Khan Begadav Le'Yifram, then he's violating the pasuk that says you're not allowed to rip your clothing. A Kohen Gadol is never allowed to rip his clothing when he's of oval. Answers the Gemara, Shmuel Rabbi Yehuda Svir like. Shmuel holds like Rabbi Yehuda. The Amar, who said, Kol Kera She'enim Avdol Safa Shaloi Eine Ela Kera Shatiflis. If any rip that doesn't rip the edge of the shirt, it just rips below that, that's a rip of nonsense. According to Rabbi Yehuda, This rip over here is not even anything. And Rabbi Yehuda can argue against that brisa. So therefore, Rabbi Shmuel held like Rabbi Yehuda. Says the Gemara, if he holds like Rabbi Yehuda, then we have another question. Mi islay Rabbi Yehuda kriya b'kohen gadol. Does Rabbi Yehuda hold that a kohen gadol is allowed to rip at all? V'atanya, we learned in a brisa, it's not true. Ilu nema roish. A kohen gadol, according to Rabbi Yehuda, is not allowed to even do a mock rip, like pretend he's joining it, because the brisa says, "Ilu nema roish lo yifra vegad lo yifra." If the Torah would tell you that a kohen gadol is not allowed to rip his clothing, and now allowed to cut his hair, and is now allowed to allow his hair grow, that it's talking about the kohen gadol who's supposed to rip off the head of the hair covering of the saita, or rip the clothing of the saita before she drinks. I would think that's what the pasuk's meaning, and that means that he's supposed to get a kohen hedyot to do that job, not him. Talmud Lamed, the pasuk says es roishoy, his own head lo yifra, he's not allowed to let it grow. Uvagadav, his own clothing. Here's the point: lo yifra, he's never allowed to rip it. She'ena bepriya prima kol iker div Rabbi Yehuda. Rabbi Yehuda says he's not allowed to rip it, even to mock rip it. If somebody dies, he's totally not allowed to rip his clothing. Rabbi Shmuel says ein parim kederach shebnei adam parimim el mamata vehedyet mamala. Rabbi Shmuel says he's allowed to rip, but only from the bottom, not from the but not like a hedyot. A common kohen is supposed to rip from the top. So the question is, if Shmuel held like Rabbi Yehuda, then a kohen gadol would not be allowed to rip at all. And says the Gemara, Shmuel savalak Rabbi Yehuda b'chada upalang galei b'chada. Shmuel agreed with Rabbi Yehuda in one area where he held a rip below the end of the shirt, below the edge of the shirt, is not considered a rip. So if the kohen gadol did that, he didn't violate anything, because that's not considered a rip. However, he disagrees with Rabbi Yehuda on the other matter. Rabbi Yehuda said a kohen gadol should not rip at all. But Rabbi Shmuel says a kohen gadol could rip. New Mishnah. Kol hatodir mechavera koydem es chavera. As you know, anything that comes more often takes precedence than the other thing that doesn't come more often. Like Shachris comes before Musaf, right? Because you daven Shachris every day. And the carbon of Tamid takes precedence over the carbon of the Musaf. Anything that's more holier than its partner takes precedence than its partner. We're going to see examples of that. What does that refer to? Then the Mishnah says like this. Let's say you have a choice. Let's remember the picture. A kohen gadol, when he does an avera, right, he brings a cow, as you can see in the picture. When the tzibur does the avera based on the paskin of the Sanhedrin, right, they follow the Sanhedrin, they also bring a cow for a chatas, a par helim davash tzibur. So let's say you have, in the Beis Hamikdash, you have a choice, par Mashiach, the par of the kohen gadol, or par ha'eda ondim, or the par helam davash tzibur are both standing. Which cow do you do first? Par hamashiach koydin lepara eda b'chol maasav. You should do the par belonging to the kohen gadol prior to doing the cow belonging for the tzibur. And we're going to see the reason for that shortly. Says the Gemara, Menohani mili. How do you know that something that comes often takes precedence than a counterpart? Amar Abaya says the Amakra, because the pasuk says, Milvad oila saboike, besides the carbon, the oila that you bring in the morning, asher la oila sabtamin, which is the oila that you brought constantly, you bring the carbon musaf. Tasu is eila. So michte, let us see. Ksiv oila saboike. The pasuk already described it as the oila that you bring in the morning. Oila satamid lamali. Why does the Torah have to describe it as the oila that you bring constantly? It's extra words. And says the Gemara, Hachikam Rachmana. The Torah teaches you like a general rule. Kol tadira kadma. Anything that comes more often, it takes precedence. Anything that comes more common takes precedence than something that doesn't come so common. Says the Gemara, V'chol hamakudish mechaverei hu koidim chaverei. So anybody who's more holier than his friend takes precedence of his friend. So let's take a person that's more holier than their counterpart, a kohen. So Minolan, how do you know that a Kohen, because he's more holier, takes precedence? The Tani Rabbi Shmuel taught us, Viki Dashtoi, you're supposed to honor the holiness of the Kohen. L'chol Tovash Kedusha, anything that has to do with holiness. Liftoyach Rishon, Ulevarach Rishon, to start first or to make the bracha first. You honor him. You honor him to go into a place first, or you call him to the Torah, and he's the first, gets the first aliyah. Or if you're dividing a part, something in equal parts, and you're splitting it, you ask him to choose which one he wants to pick. He should take, the choice that he wants. He picks first, basically. If you're choosing out odds and evens, let the kohen pick odds or evens first. Anyway, Par Kohen Mashiach Par Eidu. We go to Yud Gimel Amud Aleph. So the Mishnah said that the Par Kohen Mashiach takes first, then the Para Eidu. Menal Hanimili. Why do we say that? The Tana Rabbanan, the rabbis taught. B'sarav Oisoi Kasha Sarfas Parishan. Torah tells you burn the Par Helam Davashat Tzibor like you burn the par belonging to the Kohen. Rishon. It calls the Kohen Gadol the first one. Ma Tamad Loima HaRishon. Why does the Kohen Gadol's cow called the first one? They're both cows and they're both brought on mistaken psak. And says the Gemara, if you're in a pinch and you have two cows, one belonging to the Kohen Gadol and one belonging to the Par Tzibor, the Par Kohen Gadol takes first. Tana Rabbanan, the rabbis taught, Par Kohen Mashiach or Par Eidu Oimdim. If you have the power of the Kohen Gadol and the power of the congregation standing, Par Kohen Mashiach koydem the Par Eidu b'chol ma'asav. The Par Kohen Mashiach takes precedence. Now here, the Gemara gives you another reason. Hoil, since, Mashiach, the Kohen Gadol, mechaper, the Kohen Gadol is bringing about an atonement, the Eidah miskaperes, and the congregation needs an atonement. So it makes more sense, sheyagdim hamachaper, we try to make sure to bring atonement for the Kohen Gadol, lamaschaper, before we bring atonement to the people who need the atonement from the Kohen Gadol. And then we find that by Yom Kippur as well. First, the Kohen Gadol had to bring a kapara on Yom Kippur regarding himself and regarding his family. And then, Uvad Kol Kahal Yisrael, then he brings the kapara for the rest of Tzibur. Now the Gemara says, Par Elim Daval Shel Tzibur, Koydel Lepar Shel Avodah Zarah. So if we look at the animation, and we say like this, when the tzibur, right over here, when the Sanhedrin paskins, you're allowed to do avodah zara, right, by mistake, and all the Jews did avodah zara. So the Chumash says they bring a carbon, two animals. The cow is for an oila, the goat is for a chatas. Okay, so then of course, let's just do it this way. If there is a king, a regular Jew, or a Kohen Gadol that does avodah zarah on his own, they bring a female goat. Okay, now let's back into the Gemara. Okay, now par helam davar shatzibur koydin lepar shel avodah zarah. If you had the cow that was brought on a helam davar shatzibur, takes precedent over the cow that was brought when the Yidden did avodah zarah. My Tama, watch the difference. Hai chatas, the par helam davar shatzibur, the cow was a chatas of a high oila, and the par belonging that you brought as an avodah zarah was an oila. As you can see, that was the cow when the Yidden did avodah zarah by paganism. They brought it as an oila, and a chatas precedes an oila. Says the Gemara, the Tanya, the ikra is a chatas ashel rishayna. The Torah says you always bring the chatas first. Ma Talmud Loima. Why does the Torah says rishayna? Im lelama shetei chatas rishayna harei k'vanema v'sasheni yasa oila kamishpat. If it's to teach you that the chatas comes first, well, the pasuk says later on that the second animal should be brought as an oila. So I understand that the first animal was a chatas. Elazeb bin Ya'am. That's a teaching on kol Torah kula. When you have a choice between a chatas and an oila, shehei kol chatos koidmes. Every chata should be before every oila. Haboy mimam. The kaimelam, this holds true. That fil chatas oif koidemes loilas behema. That even a chatas oif, a bird chatas, takes precedence over over an animal oila. So again, that's how you bring it, the order that it's brought in the base of Migdash. Now here comes other cases. Par avodah zara, koidim l'seir avodah zara, amai. If you have the par that the tzibur brought because they did avodah zara on behalf of the Sanhedrin, which that par was an oila, and seir avodah zara. So the seir avodah zara means the goat that was brought. Let's say an individual did avodah zara, which would come first? One's an oila. This is a chatas. I would say the seir comes first. As the Gemara, the par comes first. Now, why? The par is an oila. Amai, hachatas v'hay oila. This par is an oila. The seir that's brought in avodah zara is a chatas. So why does that take precedence? The chatas of avodah zara is missing an aleph. The chatas kesiv. So this seir, somehow this chatas that's brought as part of the oil and the chatas, that chatas was missing, let's say, the letter A or the aleph, and therefore it's a weaker type of chatas. So if you have a choice, if it comes in line, you would bring an oila, the par helam davar tzibur will take precedence to that. The par of the avodah zara, the par of avodah zara would take precedence for the sir avodah zara. It's interesting. They're both brought, so you would actually bring the cow first, and then you bring the goat. That's what the Gemara is saying. Rava Amma kamishbat ksibei. Rava says kamishbat. So it's written now. The Gemara says like this: Seir avodah zara koidim seir nasi. You have a seir avodah zara, right? Is before the goat of the nasi, right? They're both chatas, the seir of the king and the seir of avodah zara. They're both chatas. The seir of avodah zara, the tzibur, comes before the seir of the king. My tama, hay tzibur v'hayachid. First, the chatas of the tzibur takes precedence over the chatas of the kohen, of the king. Seir nasi, you have the seir of the king. Koydem seiras yachid. If the king is bringing a chatas for his aveira, he takes precedence over the female goat that's brought by the chatas of an individual. My timer, hay melech v'hay. The king always goes first. Seiras yachid. Now, let's go back. When a person does an aveira, he can either bring a female sheep or a female goat. Let's say you have two guys come to the base of Mikdash at the same time. One is bringing a female sheep and one is bringing a female goat. Both are bringing a katas. Who do we makra first? So the Gemara says, Siras Yachid Kedemes L'Chivsas Yachid. The one that's bringing the goat takes precedence of the one that's bringing a sheep. Says the Gemara, Vatanya, we learned in the Brisa, Kivsa Yachid Kedemes L'Siras Yachid. We learned the opposite, that the sheep takes precedence over the goat. Amar Abaya, it's not. Tanoi, it's a machlekes Tanoim. Masavar, one holds Seir Adifa. The goat takes precedent, Shekei Nisrabe Eitzel Avodah Zara B'Yachid, because we see that the Torah prefers the goat, because when a person does Avodah Zara, he could only bring a goat. There's no choice. It's when you're bringing a regular Avera, you have a choice. But when you did Avodah Zara, you could only bring a goat. So we see the Torah preferred a goat. Mar Savar, but the other one holds Kifsa Adifa. When you bring a sheep, that's more special. Shekenus Rabba Ba'alya, because you bring more onto the Bizbeach, because you have to be makar of the tail. Oimer Kaidem Lekeves Ba'imai, you makar of the Oimer before you makar of the sheep that was brought along with it. Shtei Alechem, you busy yourself baking the shtei alechem, koidim l'ksavasim, before you on Shavuos check and prepare the sheep, haboyim, because the main thing is the shtei alechem. The main thing of the second day of Pesach is the omer. So zehaklal dava haba begin liyoim, koidim l'dava haba begin lechem. The one that comes for the main part of the day, which is the omer and the shtei alechem, takes precedence over the comes that's ancillary, that's secondary to it, which would be the keves that come along with the omer and the shtei lechem. Now the new Mishnah. Mishnah begins, ha'ish koidim l'isha. A man takes precedence to a woman. Regarding what? Lahachiyos, if you're trying to save the life of a man or a woman, you save the man first before the woman. Uleheshav aveda, if you have a choice to return aveda, you can only return one of them. you try to return the man's lost object before the woman's. But isha kademis ish. But a woman, you would give precedence over a man. Liktsus, when it comes to giving money for tzedakah so they can afford clothing, or to redeem from prison, because the women will be taken advantage of in prison. So we redeem a woman prior to redeeming a man if she's a hostage. Well, but if they're going to rape, if the man is at risk to be raped along with the woman, so ish kaidem leisha, then the man is before a woman, because for a man getting sodomized is much more a busha than a woman, because it's not the normal way. Tanar Habarim, the rabbis taught, you have three people in jail, him, his father, and his rebbe. So who kaidem the rabbi? He should try to redeem himself before redeeming his teacher. Rabbi kaidem la'aviv, but you redeem your teacher before you redeem your father, because your teacher brings you l'chayil haba. He teaches you Torah. Imai, your mother, is if she's in captivity, Kadamas Lekulam, takes precedence over everybody, because the potential that they're trying to be ma'anas her. Chacham Kaidim Lamelech Yisrael. Let's say a king and a Talmud Chacham is in captivity. You redeem the Chacham before the king. Chacham, but why? Why is that? Because Chacham Shemeis, a Talmud Chacham that dies, Ein Lanu Ki Yaitze Bayit. There's no one that really can replace him. Melech Yisrael Shemeis, but a king that dies, Kol Yisrael Ru'uyim L'Malchus. Anybody could become a king, but a Chacham is something else. Melech Kaidim L'Kohen Gadol, the king takes precedence over the Kohen Gadol. Shneimah, the pasuk says, "V'yayim Melech Kui Mochem Me'avdei Adonechem." We have a pasuk that Shlomo said to his people. Is a pasuk that says, "Take from the servants of your new master." And the context of the pasuk was that he told the Kohen Gadol that the new master will be the king. So the king takes precedence over the Kohen Gadol. Kohen Gadol, Kohen Navi, because the Kohen Gadol takes precedence before the Navi, because David HaMelech was saying, Mashach Oisei Sham, that they should anoint Shloim HaMelech there, Tzadek HaKayim, B'nasan HaNavi. So the way David HaMelech ordered his words, he said Tzadek HaKayim and then Nasan HaNavi. Higdim Tzadek L'Nasan. So Tzadek, the Kohen Gadol, came before Nasan. So Kohen Gadol is more important than a Navi. V'aymen, there's another pasuk that says, Shema no Yeshua HaKohen Gadol Atav Reyecha. Listen, Yeshua the Kohen Gadol, you and your friends who are Nevi'im. Yachal had Yaitisaya. I would think they were plain people, commoners. Talmud Loima, the pasuk continues there. Yachi Moifis Heiba, they were wondrous people. They Moifis El Navi. And a Moifis refers to a Navi. Shnema Menaseh Lecha Oisa Moifis. So the pasuk precedes a Kohen Gadol before a Navi. The Reyecha refers to Nevi'im. Mashiach b'Shemen HaMishcha Koydem L'Mruba B'Gadim. The Kohen that was anointed with the Shemen HaMishcha takes precedence before the Kohen that was anointed by just putting on the clothing. During the time of Yeshaya and Yeshayahu in the first Beis Hamikdash, they hid the Shemen HaMishcha. So the Kohen that was the Kohen Gadol that got the oil was lucky enough to get the oil, so he would bring a Par Helam Davar. He would bring that cow, what he does in Avera. So he's a higher Kohen. If a Kohen wasn't Zoichet to have the oil smeared on him, so he's a Kohen Gadol, but he's a less of a Kohen Gadol when comparing the two. Meruba Begadim, Kohen Mashiach Sha'ava Machmas Kiryat. But a Kohen Gadol, who is a Kohen Gadol, he takes precedence over a Kohen Mashiach that got the oil, that's Tameh now. Mashiach Sha'ava Machmas Kiryat, if a Kohen Mashiach that has a temporary Tumah takes precedence, Koidim La'ava Machmas Mubai, takes precedence over a Kohen Gadol that became injured and has a permanent handicap, so he'll never come back to being a Kohen Gadol. Ava Machmas Mubai, a Kohen Gadol that was retired because he got a handicap, Koidim L'Bashir B'Chama, he takes precedence before there's another Kohen Gadol that was anointed, but he never served in the Beis Hamikdash. He was just a spokesperson to give motivation to when the Jews went to war. He's called the Mashiach Melchama. So he takes precedence. Regular Kohen Gadol takes precedence over that. Mashiach Melchama, Kohen Skam. The Kohen Mashiach Melchama takes precedence over the substitute Kohen Gadol. You see, on Yom Kippur, they prepared a a replacement Kohen Gadol potential that just in case the Kohen Gadol cannot finish the service on Yom Kippur, we have somebody to take his place. So he's like in the batter's box. So the Mashiach Muhammad takes precedence over him. Sagan, the replacement Kohen, takes place Kohen Amarkel. He precedes the Amarkel. My Amarkel, Amar Chizda Amakula. He's the CEO of the Beis Hamikdash. The CEO of the Beis Hamikdash, so he runs all the money there. So he has a high job. A Markel Kohen the Gizbar. The Markel takes precedence over the treasurers. Gizbar Kohen Rosh Mishmar. The Gizbar, the treasurer of the Beis Hamikdash, takes precedence over the head of a group of Kahanim, the Mishmar. Rosh Mishmar Kohen Rosh Beisav. The head of the Mishmar takes precedence over the head of a family of Kahanim. Rosh Beisav Kohen and Kohen Hedin. The head of a family takes precedence over a Kohen Hedin. Asks the Gemara, Iboilu. The Gemara asks a question. Linyan Tuma, Skan u'Mashiach Mechama Ezem and Koidim. If I have a question of Tuma, let's say there's a dead body in the street, and it's a mace mitzvah, and you have a choice: the Mashiach Mechama or the replacement Kohen. Which one takes precedent? Amar Mazutra Bered Rav Nachman Toshma, come in here. The Tanya we learned in the Brisa, Shgan u'Mashiach Mechama, the Skan Kohen. The replacement of the regular Kohen Gadol in the Beis Hamikdash. And the Kohen Gadol that was there for war, they were walking on the road. When they encountered a mace mitzvah, the Mashiach Makama should tame, because there's no mitzvah that the Mashiach Makama cannot go to war being tame. He's not serving in the Beis Hamikdash. He's just being the spokesperson in war. So he should be matama for the mace mitzvah. But the replacement Kohen, he might be called upon service. Shem Yera Psul, the Kohen Gadol, if the puzzle happened with the Kohen Gadol, the Skan will come after him, will take his place. Ask the Gemara, and here we'll stop. Tanya, but we learned in a Brisa, Mashiach Melchama Koydem L'Skan, that the Mashiach Melchama takes precedence over the Skan. So we see that the Mashiach Melchama is more important than the Skan. So the answer is very simple. Regarding Tumah, the Sgan is more important than the Kohen Gadol, the Mashiach Melchama, because the Sgan is serving in the Beis Hamikdash. The Mashiach Melchama is only at war. But regarding importance, Amravina Kitani Hilach Yosei. If you're trying to save his life and you have a choice to save the life of the Mashiach Melchama, so then, or the Sgan, the Mashiach Melchama will take precedence over the Sgan. Okay, we're going to stop by the Mishnah on the bottom of your Gimel Amud Aleph. We'll catch up tomorrow and finish Be'ez Hashem the Masechta.